Thank you again so much for your message. And the title of this forum, Ekaterina, that you gave was Religious Histories of Women's Pain. Religious Histories of Women's Pain. So really interesting, and we're intrigued by your area of study, but also just with you and your person. So thank you so much for being here. And just whenever you're ready, Ekaterina, go ahead.
Here, if I just can just keep going and going. Right. Uh-huh. No, it's better. Is it better? Hello. Okay, perfect. Can we get my slideshow, please? Great. All right. Well, thank you for all of you who stayed. More early modern Protestant theologies are coming up. More Luther and more Genesis 3. However, for the forum, I would like to talk about some of my research in the history of religious interpretations of women's reproductive pain, and the way these interpretations have changed from pre-modern to medieval to early modern era, the emergence of the Protestant tradition, and how these religious understandings of women's reproductive pain have been connected with religious constructions of patriarchy. So this is based on the book I'm finishing on theologies of suffering in medicine in early modern era. So it's going to be a little bit more academic, and I look forward to engaging you on this. So obviously the Bible is very important for pre-modern and early modern traditions. In the key biblical text for pre-modern and early modern religious interpretations of women's reproductive pain was Genesis 3:16. Again, we remember the book of Genesis, Genesis 3. Adam and Eve are persuaded by the serpent. They taste the fruit from the forbidden tree. God discovers them. He expels them from the garden and pronounces, after pronouncing specific punishments for the serpent, for the woman, and for the man. So the specific punishments or condemnations, divinely pronounced in Genesis 3, they are crucial for how pre-modern theologians and early modern theologians viewed the origin of women pain. So I am going to cite these condemnations here. Genesis 3:15-19, the Lord said to the serpent, because you have done this, well, there are some other condemnations coming before that. Cursed are you among all animals and among all wild creatures. Upon your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat in the days of your life. And now an important one comes. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring, which is the serpent's offspring, and hers. He will strike your head, and you will strike his feet. Now to the woman, the Lord God said, I will make your pangs in childbirth exceedingly great. In pain you shall bring forth children, yet your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. And then finally the condemnations to the man, because you have listened to the voice of your wife, and have eaten of the tree about which I commanded you, you shall not eat it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In toil You shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread until you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken. You are dust, and to dust you shall return. All right, so the story of Adam and Eve's this disobedience to God's command was very important for pre-modern theologians, and to understand that, I'm going to introduce a couple of theological terms, I promise not a lot, in order to understand the subsequent discussion. So, as you probably know, the events of Genesis 3 were known in the history of Christian thought as the fall. Why the fall? Because they represent the fall of the first people from grace to what medieval theologians described as the state of sin. While before Adam and Eve tasted the forbidden fruit, their condition was referred to as the state of innocence, or the state of original righteousness. So, sort of from a medieval perspective, you have Adam and Eve in the state of original righteousness. Then they disobey God's commandment, they taste the forbidden fruit, and something really happens, almost like on this metaphysical level. Because of the disobedience, something changes within Adam and Eve, and they are moved from this state of original righteousness to that state of sin. Now there is this kind of sin which affects all who they are. And that point of the fall from the state of original righteousness to the fall of sin, was seen as this crucial turning point in the history of humanity, which separated people from God. And this is a very ancient tradition. I mean, it's arguably in scripture, it's definitely developed by Augustine in the 5th century, and that is still very much present and alive in medieval Christianity. So now there's a whole lot of discussion about what happens to people as they fell, what happened after the fall and they moved from the state of original righteousness to the state of sin. And part of this question is the question about human suffering. And medieval theologians were asking if suffering was something which Adam would have experienced while still in the state of original righteousness before the fall. And medieval theologians they used a lot of medieval philosophy, Aristotle's philosophy, as they explored this question, specifically philosophy of potentiality. So the conclusion, the general consensus of medieval theologians was that Adam's body in the state of innocence could not suffer in actuality, but could suffer in potentiality. It's kind of a little confusing, but essentially what they meant is that Adam's body had potential to suffer before the fall, but it didn't actually suffer. But after the fall, this potential suffering in Adam's body was actualized. It became actual. So after the fall, Adam's body became subject to suffering, subject to diseases, and all kinds of different pain, which ultimately led to death. And because medieval thinkers strongly associated death with sin, as I talked about in my sermon before, there is this connection of the fall, sin, suffering, physical suffering, and death. Although generally medieval theologians would agree that death was something which existed there, which would be possible for Adam, but again, only as a potential thing. But after sin came, death became actual thing. So now, when I talk about this discussion, I keep referring to Adam. Adam's body, which could potentially suffer, Adam's body, which actually suffered. And my reference to Adam, not just Adam and Eve or the first people, actually is not arbitrary, because medieval questions about origin of pain and suffering medieval questions about pain and suffering were deeply gendered. So with some exception, like there was this work in the 13th century, a work of early Franciscan theology, Summa Hallensis, but with the exception of this work, pretty much every major scholastic treatise in the Middle Ages, when they discuss the question of suffering of the human body, of the potential, of human body to become what they call physically corrupt, they specifically talked about Adam's body. Not Eve's body, not Adam and Eve's body, but specifically about Adam's body. So now, what kind of questions did medieval theologians ask about Eve's body? Well, there were mainly two kinds of questions they were interested in. The first one was whether Eve would suffer during pregnancy and childbirth while still in the state of innocence before the fall. The second question was if Eve was a virgin or if after the fall she would still be virgin. And both questions were actually pretty ancient too. They were traced back to Augustine, again, 5th century, and now we are in the Middle Ages, 12th, 13th, 14th century. And the authority of Augustine over this question largely determined medieval answers to that. So kind of a general consensus in medieval theology was that perhaps in the state of innocence, Eve would experience some unpleasantness of pregnancies. They called it normally Latin word gravitas, which is burdens. So Eve would have had some burdens of pregnancy before the fall, but really reproductive suffering surrounding pregnancies and childbirth, they really came after the fall as a specific punishment from God declared in Genesis 3:16, which we just read. And then with the second question, they would say, well, perhaps, after the fall, Eve would become, as they would say, biologically corrupted, but she would be before the fall, but she would still not experience sexual desire or passions or pleasure because those were seen as somehow corrupting too. Which is interesting because those questions were asked normally about Eve's body. These questions were not asked about Adam, but just about Eve. So Genesis 3:16, God's words to Eve that she would experience increasing pangs in childbirth, that she will bring forth children in pain, and then her husband shall rule over her. They were viewed in the medieval tradition as a sort of almost like a defining scripture for understanding what it means to be a woman. And that was because medieval theologians, again, they viewed it as applying not just to Eve, but to all women, because all women were seen essentially as Eve's descendants. So all women would be subjects to those punishments. And those punishments were generally divided into two groups. The first group was suffering associated with conceptions, pregnancy, labor and delivery. Childbirth suffering of Genesis 3:16 were largely applied to all reproductive experiences of women involving some sort of pain or suffering and danger. And then the second category of punishments was the female's subjugation to men. That Eve was told that her husband would rule over her, and that verse was understood that it generally applies to all husbands rule over all wives, so men rule over women. So as medieval theologians talked about these punishments, they differentiated between physical and spiritual punishments. Now, they were not in agreement and physical punishments are punishments which were inflicted upon Eve's body, and spiritual punishments were punishments which were inflicted upon Eve's soul. Now, medieval theologians were not in agreement regarding which specific punishments which Eve had to suffer were spiritual and which ones were physical. So one example, early Franciscan theology, again, Summa Hellensis is sort of a synthesis of Franciscan thought, talked about 3 categories of punishments. So punishments of hardships of pregnancy and punishments of pain in childbirth were imposed. Those were physical punishments. They were imposed upon Eve's bodies, and consequently, all women have to suffer the physical punishments. However, the women's subordination to men was a spiritual punishment, because that punishment, the Franciscan tradition would claim, was imposed on Eve's soul, or it was imposed on Eve's reason. So for the fact that women are subject to men was seen as somehow reflected in women's soul, or somehow reflected in women's reason, because of this is how God chose to punish Eve in Genesis 3:16. Similarly, another kind of monumental work of medieval systematic theology, Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologia. Aquinas would say all these 3 punishments were ultimately imposed on women's body, not on women's soul. But Aquinas would say, well, the punishment about women's subordination to men is just that Eve would feel resistance towards obeying her husband's will. So that's the punishment. The punishment is women's resistance to male domination. But in fact, Aquinas would say in Summa, the actual subordination of women's to men is not even a punishment, it's a part of divine order. This is how God instituted things even before sin. Men are heads, women follow. So, and that is also present in other writers, other medieval writers, more mystical theologians. A famous medieval mystic, Bernard of Clairvaux, he kind of read Genesis more allegorically, said, well, Eve and all women, they're associated with flesh. They're curious, they're ignorant, they're foolish, they're lacking wisdom, while Adam is associated with reason. So now we want our reason to keep our body in subjection. That's why Adam's responsibility was to rule over Eve, even before the fall, to make sure she doesn't do anything silly. But guess what? She did something silly. She tasted the fruit, and that kind of led to the fall. But the hierarchy is still there. Women are like body, men are like reasons. Reason should control the body, men should control women. So this is sort of a medieval theology surrounding women's reproductive pain. So before we move to how it changed in the early modern era, I want to say a few words about actual experiences of women's reproductive pain in early modernity, because obviously theological interpretations and what is happening in human experience are intrinsically connected. So if we look at sort of discussion of medical texts or other texts, which we know from the medieval or early modern era about women's reproductive experiences, well, I should start with men's stages of life. There is a whole tradition in early modern theology about discussing men's stages of life, how sort of a man becomes a man matures from a boy to an adult. And normally, men's stages of life are connected in that tradition with the man's growing responsibility and man's growing involvement in society. And very little is said about, normally, marriage and fatherhood are not factors in this tradition of describing men's stages of life. They're not mentioned. In fact, perhaps the only real factor is adolescence is mentioned as a sort of a time of sexual maturity, that's pretty much it. Men's stages of life are linked to men's work. Now, although we do not have that sort of formal discussion of women's stages of life in medieval and early modern literature, what we do see, it's almost always related to women's relationship to a man and women's sexual status. Woman first is a virgin, then she's a wife, and then she is perhaps a widow. So this is how a woman progresses through life, through early modern eyes. And while we do have marriage age varying across regions of Europe, especially by class, commonly, once a girl reached puberty, she was considered marriageable. So we are looking at 13, 14, 15 years old girls getting married, and marriage commonly meant the beginning of continuing cycles of pregnancy or pregnancy losses, deliveries, then periods of nursing, long periods of nursing up to 2 years, and then another pregnancy. And that was pretty much the life cycle of an early modern woman. Pregnancy, nursing, another pregnancy. Pregnancy, nursing, another pregnancy. So because starting again from essentially being a teenager and continuing into early 40s. So therefore, women's reproductive experiences were very central for how early modern people imagined what it means to be a woman, what it means to live life as a woman. In other words, women's reproductive experiences kind of defined this vision of womanhood. And what was central for reproductive experience of early modern women? Well, essential to them was essentially physical danger and physical pain. So how so? Well, obviously we don't know for sure to what extent being an early modern woman, how much early modern women actually spent their life in suffering or anticipation of suffering, but what we do know is that generally childbirth was a dreaded event. It wasn't like this sort of a contemporary Western happy experience. But that was something very dangerous and very painful. It was a lot of women died in childbirth. It could be debilitating, and it certainly meant agonizing pain. So we know that early modern women used a variety of comforting resources, including, prayer and religious consolation. There was magic charms and ritual. There were families and friends. Pretty much, perhaps the actual rate of maternal demise was about 2 women per 100. That's what historians estimate, which makes it, for an average woman, a risk to actually die in childbirth was between 5 to 7%. And since women gave multiple births, if we look at the rate, it was probably very likely that most women at least knew someone, at least one person, at least one other woman who died in childbirth, and perhaps even witnessed another woman dying in childbirth, because, I'll get to it in a second, childbirth was this sort of a communal experience, this communal event. So while death was a risk factor, also childbirth meant a risk of injury and a risk of complications. Pretty much anything which we would now associate with high-risk pregnancies was not treatable, but also vaginal tearing, prolapses, could be very debilitating, and which are now treated, but they used not to be treatable, and they could have really bad consequences for women. So, unlike contemporary North American births, in early modern Europe, births were a communal affair, but also all women's affair. What does it mean? Well, And once a woman approached labor, she began to prepare by choosing friends and neighbors she wanted to come to help you with childbirth. And that had both practical functions, but it also had sort of a social functions, as this childbirth is this like community bonding experience for women. Now, for women, because a father was never present at childbirth unless a woman was dying. That's when they called the husband. And there would typically be a midwife whose level of medical skill would differ. Some midwives were more skilled, some midwives were essentially an older, more experienced woman from the village who assisted with a lot of, without any kind of formal training, who assisted a lot of women with having children. And really, the only time a male physician would come, and physician was always male, in that culture was essentially, again, if woman was likely died, and they would call on a surgeon, if they could afford a surgeon, to essentially dissect the infant and pull the infant out of the mother or dissect the mother, and that was always the idea that a surgeon would come to birth. It was a death sentence, and it was a dreaded experience. Infections were rampant. If a woman had, if a fetus was abnormally presented, baby would come out, face or arm, face first, head first or arm first, then it requires significant skills to turn the baby in utero, which was not always possible, and oftentimes abnormal fetal presentations, which are now kind of easily solved with C-sections most of the time, at least in the West. They would also mean death sentence. And cesarean sections were very rare and almost always resulted in the death of the mother, so they were performed only to save the child. I don't know if any of you watched House of the Dragon, the HBO series, but when I was watching it, which aired later last year, but I was watching it as kind of like a theme coming, it's a fantasy show, coming up as well, the woman can't deliver a baby, they'll do a C-section, but it means that the mother will die. But, the king will have a male heir. So I was watching it and I was like, that's totally medieval. That's a very real thing. You can do a C-section to save the baby, but mother's gone. So, as we see, childbirth was quite a dangerous and always painful, extremely painful, it still is, but extremely painful experience for early modern women. But that was not, but women's reproductive suffering continued well beyond labor and delivery. Infant mortality in early modern Europe was very high. For example, in Germany, where Luther was and out of which context he will write about women's reproductive experience, the infant mortality rate was, it's estimated from the sources we have at roughly 154 deaths for 1,000 live births. And guess what? This number, 154 deaths of infants who were already born in the first year of 1,000 live births, this is the lowest number we have for Western European countries. So in all the other Western European countries, it was much higher. So following labor, as I mentioned, with the exception of upper class women who were likely to use wet nurses, many women continued to breastfeed their children until they turned 2, which will sort of also help space children a little bit due to natural contraceptive effects of breastfeeding. Artificial contraception was very rare and underdeveloped. So most women, as they would win their children, they would soon get pregnant again, and a kind of reproductive cycle continue until they hit their early 40s. Now, we should remember that early modern women's life expectancy was much shorter than our life expectancy today, which means that essentially many women spent almost the entirety of their life being pregnant, nursing children, having children, and then raising children. And many women never lived to a moment of, to sort of like an empty nester moment, when their children would get married, and like their daughters would go and live with their husband's family, like and sons would bring, wives there. But many women would never even get to like all their children are married, but they would die. So all their lives since they were 13 is about having children, nursing children, raising children. Now, another part of reproductive experiences is obviously reproductive loss, which was perhaps common, but again, because they didn't have ultrasounds, they didn't have early pregnancy tests, early modern women were commonly not as aware of early miscarriages as contemporary women, at least in the West, are. So pregnancy was not considered confirmed until a mother felt what they described as quickening, essentially feeling a fetus movement in utero. So until a mother felt the baby move, which normally doesn't happen until month 4 or month 5, a woman was not really considered pregnant. A big kind of contemporary sign, a missed period, didn't even make it to a reliable pregnancy sign because of continuous breastfeeding. Women did not have a reliable menstrual cycle, commonly. So at the same time, a missed period was considered harmful for women, so there was a lot of sort of herbal remedies to bring menstruation back, and who knows how many miscarriages those herbs caused along the way, which obviously wasn't helpful for women as well. So as pregnancy progressed, stillbirth also remained a known risk, and obviously women who were not able to conceive, it was sort of considered one of the worst things which could happen to a woman. It had negative economic consequences for women. It could have negative consequences for her marriage. And typically, if a couple was not able to have children, woman was blamed for that. Man was not blamed for that. So if a woman was didn't have to go through this reproductive cycle because she didn't have children, in a way, it would be even worse for her than going socially and communally than going through this constant pregnancy cycle. So now we're getting to the 16th century, the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. We have this theological tradition of understanding women's reproductive pain from the Middle Ages, and we also have this reality of women's reproductive pain which happens. So in this context, both the sort of medical and social and cultural and theological context is when we get to early Protestants' interpretations of women's reproductive pain. And early Protestants, as much as medieval theologians, medieval Catholic theologians, also use Genesis 3:16 to think through women's reproductive pain. There's a famous Reformation historian, David Steinmetz, who talked about Luther's sermons and lectures on the Bible as a composition of theological fiction, because Luther just had this very vivid imagination, and he made sort of like the stories spring to life. And that is certainly true when it comes to Luther's interpretations of Genesis 3. So Luther approaches this text with his kind of vivid imagination, and he asks the same question, very medieval question: what would Eve's life would be like if she didn't believe the serpent, if she didn't taste the fruit, if she remained in the state of original righteousness? And Luther believes that, yeah, her life, her pregnancies had to be very easy. That's what he says. just as a pretty girl, without any inconvenience, nay, even with great pleasure and some pride, wears on her head a beautiful wreath woven from flowers. So, if she had not sinned, Eve would have carried her child in her womb without any inconvenience and with great joy. Regrettably, we know, regrettably for Eve, and for all of us ladies here, Eve did fall into sin. So now, because of that, women experience reproductive suffering. Again, for Luther, the idea of reproductive suffering is it's very broad. It's not just pain in childbirth. It's the entire cycle of pregnancies. It's conception and pregnancy and birth and beyond, and caring for the infant. And Luther looks at that and he says, look, it's so hard. First you have this conception, then you have months of discomfort and distress. And Luther lists all these things experienced by pregnant women as consequence of his punishments. He says women experience very painful headaches, dizziness, nausea, an amazing loathing of food and drink, frequent and difficult vomiting, toothache, and a stomach disorder which produces a craving called pica for foods from which nature normally shrinks. In addition, he adds, miscarriages, stillbirth, and infertility are all additional expressions of Eve's reproductive punishment. Even if a pregnancy is successful, it still ends in this excruciating, dangerous, and even life-threatening labor and delivery. So while childbirth is the peak of reproductive suffering, even beyond that, mother's physical pain and inconvenience continues in her tasks of nourishing her children. Goodness, I just stopped my stopwatch. Oh no. Mark, do you know how long have I been going? Do you know how long have I been going? I accidentally stopped my stopwatch.
About 35 minutes.
Okay, perfect. All right, so in addition, Luther thinks that for Eve and all women's, reproductive punishments also increased her decreased fertility. Luther looks around and says, looks like birds and fish and dogs and cats and pigs, everybody produces these large litters, while women are regrettably limited to maximum one child per year. So Luther sees this as very unfortunate. And he says, well, it must be because of Eve's sin. If woman didn't sin, she would have children much more often and much more children. And he says, look, even women sometimes have twins or even triplets or quadruplets. This is kind of a remnant of women's former fertility. And that's what would have been possible for women regularly if Eve had not sinned. So, yes. So, typically, when we read Luther's writings on medicine, some of which I've discussed in my message before, there is this constant dialectic between pain and relief. Pain is real, suffering is real, it's because of sin, it's because of the devil, but also there is relief. God provides medicine, angels guard medicine. There is a hope, there is a possibility of relief. There is sin and there is grace. There is bodily suffering and there is healing. That's kind of a common thread throughout his writings about medicine. However, when Luther writes specifically about women's reproductive pain, the theme of hope and relief is not very pronounced there at all. And I think this is because of his historical context. Because of, in his context, there's really very little possibilities of physical relief, which would be available to women who were pregnant or who experienced labor complications. There was really very little they could do for pain management. So But for Luther, this is a theological point. That God actually did not, God did promise salvation on account of faith alone. God did not promise an easy labor. God did not promise an easy pregnancy. On the contrary, in Genesis 3:16, God promised to increase women's pain in childbearing. And because of God's condemnation on Eve, it still stood in Luther's 16th century, as it did many centuries ago. So for Luther, the fact that there was very little medical means of relief available to pregnant and laboring women had theological reasons behind it. It was not an issue of medicine. It was an issue of theology. So Luther stressed the importance for women to rely on God, to ask God for help. That was kind of a spiritual relief, was the main recourse which he advised to women. And another interesting thing was that Luther emphasized that the dangers and pain of pregnancy and childbirth were irreversible. He also advocated for behaviors which were believed in his context to decrease dangers to the unborn child. Like, he stressed that pregnant women should be treated gently. They should not be intentionally scared or exposed to disturbing images. And he has some very bizarre stories about what happens if this is not observed. Like a child was born with red marks over the child's body. Oh, this is because a mother must have been scared and moved her hands over her pregnant body, and where mother put her hands, that's where these red birthmarks appeared. Or there was another story, and Luther recalls them, well, this is what happened in this town in this time. People know that's what happened. A man whose face looked the one of a dead man. And the man apparently says, well, this is when my mother was pregnant, she saw a corpse, she got scared, that's why I look this way. Or there was an event of, another weird story, there was a neighbor and he had a mouse. And neighbor wanted mice in his yard, and neighbor wanted to get rid of mice, so a neighbor attached a little bell to the tail of a mouse. And then there was a pregnant woman living next door. So now the pregnant woman hears this music, she looks out, oops, music, who's making music? Oh, a mouse. So the woman is super scared about mouse who runs around making music. And then it's time for this pregnant woman to give birth, and guess what? She gave birth to a mouse. Luther actually records that. So it strikes us as completely outlandish, right? Really grotesque stories. But what is interesting here, that first of all, they're fully grounded in medieval and early modern understanding of the body. That's a very different way in which they imagined a body. We now think about the body, at least in the West, although we know the body is impacted by the factors, but generally we think about the body as a sort of more of an enclosed system. My body is my boundary. I'm within my body. This is the outside world. Early modern view of the body, a body was more of a porous system. Body is kind of open to the world. Body can be affected and malleable by the forces in the outside world, both physical forces and spiritual forces. So because they didn't really know, early moderns didn't really know what causes congenital abnormalities, what causes and what might cause certain diseases in infant, they would attribute this to all these external factors. Women ate certain food or saw certain images, like mother ate too much red strawberries and now the infant's face is red. So all these silly stories are actually in Luther's sermons about what not to do to pregnant women. It's actually a good faith early modern attempts to protect this fetus. Because it's kind of like an attempt of prenatal care in the early modern context. You make sure women are not scared, not imposed to something strange, not eat certain food, and this is the best we can do to make sure the fetus is all right. So, generally in his theology, Luther kind of always stressed on, God is a good father, grace is a relief. And as I just said, he didn't really see resources for that to talk about women's reproductive pain. So what Luther ends up doing, he actually points out that God's punishment on Eve could have been much harsher than it was, but it was not. So Luther says, well, what God could have done is, he kind of stresses, it's very interesting. He says, well, God allowed Eve to keep her sex and remain a woman. That was kind of a good thing on God's part. And then God also allowed Eve to stay with Adam. She was not condemned to loneliness. And although Eve was subject to great pain in childbearing, she was still able to reproduce and bear children. And because of that, because Eve remained a woman, because Eve remained married, because she was able to bear children, all women are able, most women, not all, most women are able to do that. And that's what Luther called glory of motherhood. And he had all this praise about women's embodied abilities to nourish children and keep their children safe and feed them. And Luther's always like, well, men are not able to do that. If you give a man a baby, man's going to handle a baby like a camel, he would say. Very interesting to me. Why like a camel? So we see there is sort of, on the one hand, there is kind of this gender essentialist and patriarchal approach. Well, women are great for producing and caring for the babies. But also it's kind of praiseworthy because in his context, mothering was viewed as women's domain, women's responsibility, and women didn't get a lot of praise for that. So the fact that Luther kind of brought this religious praise of glory of motherhood is what God wanted for women, there was some positive, definitely, undertones for that. Although, again, that was very gender essentialist. So, in his sermon on married life in 1522, Luther claimed that if you are not a woman, you should wish to become a woman in order to experience the amazing and godly work of childbirth. And then he goes ahead and says, obviously you would also suffer and possibly die in childbirth, so you make sure that if that happens, you do it in a God-honoring way. So there is that too. So, moving on towards the final part. So again, so this is Genesis 3:16, Eve is condemned to suffering in childbirth and being subject to her husband. Again, Luther continues in medieval tradition. He sees both as coming together as a punishment imposed on Eve. But what is very important, that Luther completely goes away with a medieval distinction between physical punishments and spiritual punishment, that somehow women's subjugation to men is imprinted on their soul or on their reason. For women, all these punishments are inflicted on Eve's body. So he says, God gives the woman, Eve, her torment, but proceeds soberly and spares her, absolves her of spiritual misery. This is very important. So Eve is not punished spiritually, and lays the penalty upon her body as with Adam. He says to her, I will give you much pain when you're pregnant. After that, you shall bear your children with sorrow. And thirdly, you shall humble yourself before your husband, and he shall be your Lord. In these three passages, you see nothing that does not affect the body. The soul is already saved and has become a child of God. For that reason, God turns eternal punishment into a temporal and physical one. So, why this is important, that Luther insists that all these punishments are physical? because it allows him to kind of create this juxtaposition, because a woman's physical suffering and woman's spiritual triumph. And where is woman's spiritual triumph? It's earlier in Genesis 3:14 and 15, when there is a curse upon the serpent to be stricken by the woman's offspring. And when Luther reads this, he reads it as the promise for the woman to produce a savior, right? He thinks Jesus, who would defeat the serpent, who Luther thinks is Satan. What is important here, that for Luther, that means that through woman's reproductive power, a savior will come. And for Luther, it's totally there in the text of Genesis 3:14, because the text says, your offspring. And Luther says, when we talk about offspring, we always think about the father. But this one says, your offspring. Clearly, father is not present in this text. Well, because you know what? Jesus Christ was incarnate of the Virgin Mary. So Luther says it's kind of, Eve is physically punished, but Eve has a spiritual triumph coming for her. And he even calls her punishments happy and joyful. And so for Luther, when Eve actually hears God's punishment in 3:16, she rejoices, and she sees that God is actually merciful, and although her body will suffer, through her salvation will come. So a final very important point here is that because Luther limits all this punishment to Eve's body as a kind of this temporary thing, and ultimately spiritually through Eve will triumph, he's sort of forced to make a statement that that was not Eve's situation before the fall, that Eve's subordination to Adam, that women's subordination to man, is not how God originally intended things to happen. He develops it kind of later in life. In his earlier sermon, he sometimes says, oh, that's how it was, women are less than men. This is like in 1520s. But then later on, he comes more fully to say that Eve and Adam were originally equal. That's a huge departure from medieval tradition. So he describes Eve as previously very free, and as the sharer of all the gifts of God, was no respect inferior to her husband. So for Luther, the fact that Eve was subject to Adam, women are subject to men, this all came only as a punishment as a result of sin. So for Luther, he took it for granted that women have to be subject to men, women can't have civic authority, women can't participate in the government, women's place is sort of rule over home, over household affairs. And yet Luther would say the following thing: if Eve persisted in the truth, she would not only not have been subjected to the rule of her husband, but she herself would also have been a partner in the rule, which is now entirely the concern of males. So this is a huge departure from medieval tradition. And this is what one can argue a very progressive departure for early modern theology, because he essentially says that women's subordinate role has nothing to do with their soul. It's not imprinted on their soul. It's not imprinted on women's reason. It's not part of God's original desire. But this is a purely external hierarchy, which came as a result of Eve's sin. However, for Luther did not use this to sort of challenge his current patriarchal societal structure. But in fact, he uses it to actually reaffirm patriarchy. Because for him, he looks at the first punishment, at the reproductive punishment, and he sees that this reproductive punishment has not changed. Starting from what he sees as Eve's pregnancy with Cain and Abel until the 16th century, women's reproductive suffering remained fundamentally unchanged. And again, for Luther, this is not because of limitations of pre-modern medicine, but because this is God's perpetual decree. In a similar way, Luther says, well, this is the same as women's subordination to men. It did not change, and it will not change, because this is part of God's punishment. So what I would like to conclude now, I think that there is a kind of like this idea, they still float around in more conservative Christian communities, kind of which insist on women's submission, link it to Genesis, God's design, and whatnot. But I wonder, and some of this theology still kind of reverberates even today. So I wonder how much, when I think about this thing, I think about pain relief options and how much developments there have been in pain relief since during pregnancy, how much progress there has been for managing high-risk pregnancies since early modern era. And I wonder if there is a theological point to be made there in response to this conservative construction of gender role. Because again, for that context, for early Protestant context, Luther is already there. He is eager to say that men and women are equal, they would have been equal. It's just because of this punishment, women to have to be subordinate to men, the punishment of Genesis 3:16, which hasn't changed. And in a way, I think we can look at it, and if we were to talk to Luther and say, well, look, actually it has been getting better in terms of all this suffering surrounding pregnancy and childbearing. And there is whole theological tradition which looks at grace and says, well, you know, Jesus Christ's grace works in the world, making things better. So we can say perhaps it's the work of grace which sort of relieves this curse and makes these experiences of pain during childbearing and pregnancy so much better. So can we make this same claim if we engage sort of more conservative gender theology? Can we make the same thing, say, well, God's grace is making society egalitarian too. This is not some human construction which challenges divine order, as we sometimes hear from, more conservative community, but this is the same work of grace, which actually relieves some of these curses and makes things better. Anyways, I'd like to conclude that I think that actually medical technology and things like epidural blocks, they actually can have theological significance, which we don't normally think about medicine entering theological conversations. But I do think that in this case, medical and scientific progress should be brought into theological conversations to address some of these more conservative approaches to gender roles. Thank you.
Women, questions? I want to give precedence to women here.
Yeah, most of us here that are Quakers know that in the 17th century, George Fox said that women were equal, that we returned to the garden, and that was part of salvation. So
Amen.
He totally had a very different view than Luther about that. So I'm thankful that I'm part of the Quaker tradition and not the Lutheran.
Right, and I would say that I think a lot of Luther's stuff, it's not just Lutheran tradition. It's generally, a lot of it is sort of a conservative evangelical tradition as well, who wouldn't identify as Lutheran, but if you look at some of the sort of Council for Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, I don't know how familiar with the sort of conservative, more evangelical organizations promoting conservative gender role, a lot of the sentiment is still very much there. They don't say they quote Luther, but they are very much within this tradition. So I think the tradition is very much alive beyond Lutheran denominations.
Right, absolutely, because a lot of very conservative traditions do not allow women to preach or to be ministers, and they're always under the subjugation of men within the church, and they have the power and they're not going to give it up.
So that's why I think we need to be able to challenge it on theological reasons. Just framing it as an issue, well, share your power may not be sufficient because they come at you with theological argument. They say, well, that's based on the Bible. That's why I believe that what I do is important for sort of creating an argument which involves scripture, involves theology, and is able to respond to this reality kind of theologically. But yes, thank you.
This is not a question, but more of appreciation for that insight about equal in the beginning, and then these things happened. And I had not ever, that's a new opening for me, and I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. And I agree. And I want to say that when I found it in Luther, like my mind was blown. I was like, wow, 16th century. And he really goes like, there is no sense of preceding tradition that Eve became inferior. And that's why I think it's so important, again, for this conversation that we can recover it and say, look, this is the beginning of the Protestant tradition, and that's what they were saying. The equality, there is this absolute original equality. And something changed, but can it be changed back?
Thanks, Ekaterina. Just to pick up on Carol's point, George Fox, in his experience with Christ, he said, I was drawn into Edom through the flaming sword to the place where Adam was before he fell. A very graphic language. And also with Paul talking about the new Adam in Christ, it's not only transformation, but it would also undo the penalty of the sin. In other words, male dominance no longer is in Christ Jesus. So that would be, a pretty substantive theological argument based on Paul's writings as well.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. I think this is very important, for sure.
I'm wondering what Martin Luther would say about animals and whether they can sin, because animals giving birth are in pain. If you've ever seen a cow give birth, they are in pain. So is that a result of the fall?
A great question. It is the result of the fall, but not the animal's fault. It is the result of our fall. So there is this verse in Colossians which is very important about how the creation is moaning and groaning, waiting for the sons of God to be revealed. And that is hugely important for a lot of Christian tradition, which sees sort of this cosmic consequences of sin. As sort of a sin, it's not just like a bad thing which I do, but sin is this essentially like this fundamental moral corruption which happens somehow in the first people, and that corruption somehow almost metaphysically affects the creation. Affects, like it's also in Genesis, right? When God says, well, the earth's gonna bear, thorns and thistles. That's another verse for that. So Luther stands within this tradition, so he sees humans, he wouldn't say animal sin, he would say human sin, but human sin has these bad consequences for creation. Creation suffers, and that involves animal suffering as well. And the redemption also comes to the creation, but comes through Jesus Christ and, when the sons of God, children of God are revealed. But great question.
I'm reading Alexander Hamilton book right now. And one thing that pops up often is the wife. When they get married, in those days, you had as many children as you can. I didn't hear complaints, that, the wives, they're suffering and so forth. They had those children, and that was a norm. And particularly among our founding fathers, number 10 children, not unusual, 10. So there's sort of a play going on here. The wives adjust to it, agree to it, to having the children? I'm not quite sure what's going on here.
Yeah, I mean, that is a good point. And I mean, it's like you would ask question, why would women have so many children, even relatively not that long time ago historically? And obviously there are multiple dimensions to that. And one dimension that obviously having children was sort of an economic necessity. Children are the ones who would, work on the family farm and contribute to the family's wealth, or perhaps more realistically survival. Children are the ones who took care of their parents when they were old. So but your children are workers. So most in Western history, we don't see this kind of more emotional and more effective use of childhood. They develop later. But your child starts working and helping you around your house, with like cattle and since they're 3. So you view children as workers, and you need to have workers for the family to make it. So there is this economic sort of sense. And then if a family is more affluent, then there is a sense of, children is also you reinforce your social standing. Children are the ones who are getting married, and they build your connections with other families, they build your connections with other wealth. So there is an economic reason, there's a social reason, but there is also some practical reasons that really birth control was not an option, or at least very little of an option. So even if perhaps you would not want to have that many children, you do not have an option to really not to have that many children. So I think there is that to be said, and it's sort of and that's one thing women can do. So I think it's a very complex, there are multiple dimensions to why people and obviously there's also a question of high child mortality, high infant mortality, and if you had 10 children, probably about 5 or 6 of them actually live into adulthood. And again, if we move back to the question of you need children for economic reasons, you're motivated to have more children because none of them is going to grow up.
What I find so interesting about this and the question of patriarchy, even a very common thing today, a lot of younger folks, they're taking sex-neutral plural pronouns as kind of a pushback on patriarchy, and maleness is not going to define who I should be. And I never really thought about it that way, but you really gave us some insight on the inner structures and the inner workings and the beginnings of things that, like you said, this type of thought and these ways of thinking are alive and well in politics, in our social structures, and even this is a topic that our youth are trying to kind of push back on and say, what? I'm not going to allow that powerful system to define who and what I am. So thank you so much. We're going to go ahead and break here, but thank you so much for sitting in, for your teaching, and just for this time. That was just so enlightening. So thank you, everyone.
Thank
Go in
you.
peace.